Welcome back, everyone, to The Deep Dive. Today, we are going to try to wrap our heads around something that I know a lot of you out there have been asking about, NFTs and IP law.
Yeah, NFTs are everywhere these days, but the law is always playing catch-up with technology, right?
Exactly. It seems like every time we turn around, there's a new headline about an NFT lawsuit or some controversy about ownership.
So today we are diving into the murky waters where non-fungible tokens collide headfirst with intellectual property law.
Okay, so first things first. For anyone who's maybe not completely up to speed, let's define what we mean by NFT and IP.
Terrific. NFT stands for non-fungible token. It's basically a unique digital identifier. Think of it like a digital fingerprint that can't be copied.
Right. It's like a certificate of authenticity, but for the digital world.
Exactly. It lives on a blockchain, which is a decentralized, tamper-proof record-keeping system. And this blockchain is what guarantees each NFT is unique.
So it's not like a Bitcoin, where one Bitcoin is the same as any other Bitcoin.
Right. With NFTs, each one is one of a kind. They're not interchangeable.
Like, you could have two NFTs that both represent a picture of a cat, but each one is still completely unique and distinct.
Yep. And that uniqueness is what gives them value. Kind of like a rare baseball card or an original piece of art.
And when we say IP, we're talking about intellectual property, which basically covers creative works and inventions.
Yeah, the big three are copyright, trademark, and patents.
So copyright protects things like music, books, art, original creative works.
Right. Trademarks protect brand names and logos, like the Nike swoosh or the Apple logo.
And patents protect new inventions, like a new type of engine or a groundbreaking medical device.
So for this deep dive, our main source of information is a hefty report from the U.S. Copyright Office to Congress. They've done a ton of research on the intersection of NFTs and intellectual property.
It's dense, but really interesting. Definitely worth a read if you want to go deeper into this stuff.
And we're also going to pull in some real-world examples like the NFT marketplace, NFTify, and the game Dark Forest.
Right, because we want to see how these concepts are actually playing out in practice.
It's all well and good to talk about theory, but seeing how it works in real life is where it gets interesting.
So today, our mission, if you choose to accept it, is to figure out what are the key ways that NFTs and IP law bump up against each other.
We're going to look at the potential opportunities, but also the legal landmines that creators, buyers, and platforms need to be aware of.
No easy answers, probably a lot of gray areas, but hopefully we can provide some clarity.
Yeah, and who knows, maybe even spark some new ideas for how we can navigate this rapidly evolving space.
Let's kick things off with copyright. That seems to be where most of the NFT action is, at least for now.
Right.
What are some of the big copyright questions that the Copyright Office report tackles?
Well, the report breaks it down into four main stages where NFTs and copyright potentially clash. They call it the NFT lifecycle.
Okay, that makes sense. So what's the first stage?
It all starts with the minting process. So minting is the act of creating that unique NFT and putting it on the blockchain.
Right. It's like the birth of the NFT.
Exactly. And right away at this stage, you could have a copyright issue.
Like how? What could go wrong?
Well, imagine someone creates an NFT of a digital painting or a piece of music that they don't own the copyright to.
So they're basically taking someone else's work and trying to sell it as their own NFT.
Yeah. And that right there is copyright infringement.
It's basically the same as making and selling unauthorized copies of a movie or a song.
The report points out that minting can potentially create a new copy of the work. And if you don't have permission to reproduce the copyrighted work in the first place,
So you're in trouble.
you could be liable for copyright infringement.
Makes sense. But then things get even more complicated when you start talking about smart contracts and artificial intelligence, right?
Yeah, the report dives into some really complex scenarios. For example, what happens if a smart contract is used to generate a new piece of art when an NFT is minted?
Smart contracts are kind of like little computer programs built into the NFT that can automate certain actions. So you're saying the program itself could create the artwork.
Exactly. Or what if the artwork linked to an NFT was created by an AI? Does that work even qualify for copyright protection in the first place?
Right, because current copyright law says there needs to be a human author.
And then there's the question of whether the underlying code of the NFT itself, the smart contract, might be copyrightable, separate from the actual artwork or digital asset it's associated with.
It's like you have these different layers of potential copyright at play. So if I mint an NFT of a song I wrote, the song itself is protected by copyright, and maybe the code of the NFT is too.
That's the idea, although how that would actually play out in court is still very much up in the air.
Another tricky situation that the report talks about is what happens if someone creates an NFT that simply links to a copyrighted work that's already online, like on a website somewhere.
Yeah, this is a really interesting legal gray area. Some people argue that just providing a link is fine. It's like telling someone, hey, go check out this website.
But others are saying that linking within the context of an NFT is different.
Right. Especially if it's a deep link that bypasses a website's home page and goes directly to the copyrighted work.
Some groups, like the Copyright Alliance, are worried that this kind of linking could be a form of copyright infringement, especially if it's done without the copyright owner's permission.
It's all about the context and the intent. And unfortunately, the law doesn't always provide clear-cut answers.
So what you're saying is at this first stage of minting, there are all these potential copyright issues.
And the report points out a real concern is that there often aren't any safeguards in place during minting to make sure the person creating the NFT actually has the rights to the associated content.
So it's kind of a Wild West situation.
It can be. There are a lot of opportunities for infringement and even fraud.
Okay, let's move on to the second stage in the NFT lifecycle, storage. When we talk about storing an NFT, what are we really talking about? Where is all this digital stuff actually kept?
That's a great question. Most of the time, the actual digital file that's linked to the NFT, whether it's a song or a picture or whatever, it's not actually stored on the blockchain itself.
Why not? Too much data.
Yeah, it would take up way too much space and be super expensive. So instead, it's usually stored off-chain.
Okay, so off-chain means it's on a separate server somewhere, maybe with a company like Amazon or Google.
Right. Or on a decentralized storage system like the Interplanetary File System, or IPFS.
I've heard of that. It's kind of like a peer-to-peer network where files are broken up and spread across lots of different computers.
Exactly. It's designed to be more resilient, harder to take down. But as the report notes, that also makes it potentially harder to track down infringing content.
So the NFT on the blockchain basically just contains a link or a pointer that says, hey, the actual file is over here.
Right. The NFT itself is just a small piece of code, but it points to something much bigger off-chain.
But the report does mention that it's also technically possible to store the digital asset directly on the blockchain itself, right?
It is. It's called on-chain storage. But it's not very common because, again, it can be very expensive and data-intensive.
So why does any of this matter for copyright?
Well, if we're talking about off-chain storage, the question becomes, where is that digital file being hosted?
And does the person or company hosting it have permission from the copyright owner?
Exactly. Let's say someone mints an NFT that links to an unauthorized copy of a movie that's stored on a central server.
Like if they ripped it from a streaming service and put it up on their own server without permission.
Yeah. In that case, both the person who minted the NFT and potentially the company hosting the server could face copyright issues.
And what about if the content is stored on a decentralized network like IPFS? How does that impact copyright?
It makes enforcement a lot trickier. Since the file is spread across so many different computers, it's harder to track down and remove.
So it sounds like even if the copyrighted work isn't directly embedded in the NFT itself, just the way it's stored and linked can raise copyright concerns.
Exactly. The Copyright Office report makes that very clear. Even if a copyrighted work is just linked to an NFT, there can still be copyright implications.
For the person who minted the NFT and for anyone who's knowingly linking to infringing copies.
Right. It's not a get-out-of-jail-free card just because you're not storing the file directly on the blockchain.
And if the digital asset is actually stored on the blockchain itself, that raises even more interesting questions.
Yeah, like could that part of the blockchain be considered a copy of the work under copyright law? The report raises that possibility.
Wow, that's fascinating. So storage is more complicated than I initially thought. Now let's talk about the next step in the NFT lifecycle, marketing and selling. This is where those online marketplaces come in, right?
Exactly. Places like OpenSea, Rarible, and Nftify.
They're basically the eBay or Amazon of NFTs.
Yeah. They provide platforms where people can list their NFTs for sale, connect with buyers, and handle the transactions.
And this is where copyright law gets really tricky for those marketplaces.
It does. The report dives into this issue in detail. If an NFT marketplace is actively hosting or helping to sell NFTs that link to copyrighted works being used without permission.
Well, they could potentially be held liable for copyright infringement themselves.
Right. The argument is that they're not just a passive platform. They're facilitating the sale of infringing content.
And the report also brings up the idea that these marketplaces can't always hide behind the safe harbor provisions of the DMCA.
Yeah, the DMCA has rules that protect online platforms from liability for copyright infringement by their users, but those protections have limits.
So if the marketplace knows that infringing content is being sold and they don't do anything about it, they could still get in trouble.
Exactly. And the report notes that if a marketplace is actually curating which NFTs are featured on their platform.
If they're picking and choosing and promoting certain NFTs, it suggests that they're taking on a greater responsibility for making sure those NFTs aren't violating copyright.
Right. They're not just a neutral platform anymore.
It's all very much up for debate right now, and we see this playing out in lawsuits.
Exactly. Like in the case of SA Music LLC v. Apple Inc., there's this ongoing legal debate about how much responsibility these platforms have to police what their users are doing.
So marketplaces are in a tough spot. They want to encourage people to buy and sell NFTs, but they also have to worry about copyright violations.
It's a tricky balance. And the decentralized nature of some of these platforms adds another layer of complexity.
The last stage we wanted to talk about in the NFT lifecycle is when an NFT is transferred from one person to another, like when someone buys an NFT on a marketplace.
Right. And this is where a lot of people get confused about what they're actually buying.
Because owning an NFT doesn't automatically mean you own the copyright to the digital or physical thing it represents, right?
That's exactly it. And this is a huge point of confusion for a lot of people new to NFTs.
So let's say I buy an NFT of a cool piece of digital art. That doesn't mean I can now suddenly start selling prints of that artwork, right?
Not necessarily. Owning the NFT is like having a digital deed that says you own this specific token.
It's like a certificate of authenticity, but it doesn't automatically give you the copyright to the underlying work.
Exactly. The copyright is a separate legal right. The report stresses that very clearly.
So I could own the NFT, but the artist who created the artwork still retains the copyright?
Unless they specifically transfer the copyright to you in a separate agreement.
Okay. So how does that usually work?
Well, under the Copyright Act, transferring copyright requires a written agreement signed by the copyright holder.
It can't just be implied or assumed?
Nope. And the report even mentions that using a smart contract to automatically transfer copyright is probably not legally sufficient.
So those smart contracts that are often built into NFTs, they can do a lot of cool things.
But transferring copyright probably isn't one of them, at least not legally.
It's important for both buyers and sellers to be really clear about what rights are being transferred when an NFT is sold.
Absolutely. A lot of misunderstandings and disputes arise because people don't fully understand the difference between owning the NFT and owning the copyright.
And the report highlights this confusion, right? They're concerned about the potential for buyers to be misled or disappointed.
Definitely.
Now, there is a way for the creator of an NFT to automatically grant some usage rights to the buyer, right?
Yeah. The smart contract can be programmed to grant certain licenses when the NFT is transferred.
So even though the buyer might not get full copyright ownership, they could get permission to use the work in certain ways.
Exactly. But it's not always the case.
And those licenses can be very specific. Like, you can use this image as your profile picture, but you can't print it on T-shirts.
Right. And as the report points out, sometimes those licenses can be unclear or incomplete, which just leads to more confusion and potential legal disputes.
And then we have those projects that use something called a CC0 public license. I've seen that a lot lately.
Right. CC0 stands for Creative Commons Zero. Basically, it means no rights reserved.
It's like the creator is saying, hey, anyone can do whatever they want with this work.
They're putting it into the public domain, which can be cool for encouraging remixes and creative collaborations.
Like that Bored Ape Yacht Club thing where people were making all sorts of crazy derivatives.
Exactly. But the report points out that using a CC0 license can have unintended consequences.
Especially if the creator has existing licensing deals in place. It could cause a conflict. So bottom line, the licensing situation can be complex, and it's crucial for both buyers and sellers to understand the specific terms that are attached to an NFT.
If any. Just assuming you get certain rights can lead to trouble down the road.
So we've talked about the different stages of the NFT lifecycle, but this all leads to a bigger question. How do you actually enforce copyright in the world of NFTs?
Enforcement is one of the biggest challenges, and the report spends a lot of time on this. The decentralized nature of blockchain technology makes it incredibly tricky to track down and address copyright infringement.
Especially since the digital files are often stored off-chain in all these different places.
Exactly. And while the blockchain does record who owns a specific NFT,
It can't tell whether that ownership is legitimate or not.
right, if an NFT was obtained fraudulently through a hack or a scam, the blockchain will still show the new owner as the legitimate owner.
And once something is recorded on the blockchain, it's virtually impossible to change, right?
That's the whole idea. Blockchains are immutable, and that immutability, while great for security, can be a real headache when it comes to enforcing copyright.
So if someone mints an NFT using stolen artwork, it's not like you can just go in and easily delete that NFT from the blockchain.
Nope. It's permanent.
So how are copyright holders dealing with these challenges?
Well, they are using some of the existing legal tools, like DMCA takedown notices.
The DMCA is that law that lets copyright holders ask online platforms to remove infringing content.
Exactly. So we see groups like the RIAA, the Recording Industry Association of America, sending DMCA notices to NFT marketplaces.
Trying to get them to take down NFTs that they believe are infringing on their members' copyrights.
But those notices are often only a temporary solution. And the DMCA wasn't designed with blockchain technology in mind.
So there's definitely a need for new approaches and maybe even new laws to deal with this stuff effectively.
Absolutely.
The report also mentions this concept of garbage in, garbage out. What does that mean in the context of NFTs and copyright?
It means that if an NFT is created based on a digital work without the proper rights, meaning the person who minted it didn't have permission to use the content,
Like if they just grabbed a picture off the internet and made an NFT of it?
then the ownership data that's recorded on the blockchain, while technically accurate, is based on false information from the get-go.
It's like building a house on a foundation of sand.
Yeah. And this really undermines the whole idea of NFTs as proof of authenticity.
Right. Because the blockchain is only recording the information it's given, it can't tell if that information is actually valid in the first place.
Exactly. So that initial link between the NFT and the real world, that's where authenticity needs to be established.
The blockchain can't magically solve that problem.
Yep.
Speaking of the Copyright Office, it seems they're also considering how NFTs could potentially be used in their own operations.
Yeah. It's still early stages, but there's been talk of the Copyright Office issuing official registration certificates as NFTs.
So instead of getting a paper certificate or even a digital file, you'd get a unique NFT that represents your copyright registration.
Exactly.
That's kind of cool. What are the potential advantages of doing that?
Well, the big ones are authenticity and security. It would make it much harder to forge or counterfeit a registration certificate.
Because it would be recorded on the blockchain, which is tamper-proof.
Exactly. And it would provide a more transparent and verifiable record of who owns a copyright.
You could theoretically trace the ownership of a copyright all the way back to the original registration through a chain of NFTs.
In theory, yeah.
But the report also brings up some important questions about the practicality of this. Like, would this really be a significant improvement over the existing system?
The Copyright Office already has an electronic system for recording copyrights.
Right. And some legal experts have pointed out that the Copyright Office doesn't actually verify the accuracy of the information that people submit for copyright registrations.
So even with an NFT certificate, it would still be based on whatever the applicant provides.
And then there are the technical challenges of integrating an NFT-based system with the existing legal framework.
Exactly. Like, how would you handle disputes if there's a conflict between the information in the NFT and the information in the Copyright Office database? Which one takes precedence?
It seems like a cool idea, but there are a lot of logistical and legal hurdles to overcome.
Definitely.
All right, let's shift gears and talk about trademarks. How are NFTs impacting the world of brand names and logos?
Trademarks are playing a crucial role in the NFT space. Companies are using them to protect their brands in this new digital landscape.
So how does that work? Give us an example.
Sure. Let's say a big fashion brand, like Nike, decides to release NFTs that represent virtual sneakers or clothing.
Digital versions of their real-world product.
Right. Their trademark, the Nike swoosh, helps guarantee authenticity. It assures buyers that those virtual sneakers are actually from Nike and not some knockoff.
So it's about preventing counterfeit digital goods in the NFT space, which is a huge issue.
It is. And trademarks also help build trust and brand recognition among consumers.
It's like, I know and trust this brand in the real world, so I'm more likely to buy their NFTs.
Exactly. The report emphasizes that trademarks can be a powerful tool for building consumer confidence in the NFT marketplace.
But registering trademarks for stuff related to NFTs is proving to be a headache for companies, right?
It is. The current system for classifying goods and services when you file a trademark application, it's based on something called the NICE agreement, and it was created long before NFTs even existed.
So they didn't really anticipate this whole new category of digital goods.
Nope. So the USPTO, the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office, has been trying to provide guidance on how to categorize NFTs.
Like adding examples to their manuals and stuff.
But legal experts are saying that we really need a more specific and tailored way to identify NFT-related goods and services because they are so diverse.
It's like trying to fit square pegs into round holes.
Yeah. So for instance, you have an NFT that represents a piece of digital art.
Like that famous Beeple collage that sold for millions.
Right. Now, how do you classify that under the existing system? Is it a downloadable image file? Is it something else?
The lines are all blurred.
And then you have this really big question. Does trademark protection for physical goods automatically extend to virtual goods and NFTs?
Like, if a company has a trademark for, let's say, bicycles, does that trademark also protect them if someone starts selling NFTs of virtual bicycles?
That's the million-dollar question. And the law hasn't really caught up yet.
It's uncharted territory.
And that uncertainty is making companies really nervous. They don't want to be caught off guard.
So they're being proactive and filing something called defensive trademark filings, right?
Exactly.
What are those?
Basically, it means that even if a company isn't currently selling virtual goods or NFTs,
They're going ahead and filing trademark applications specifically for those things.
just to be safe,
So if Nike isn't selling NFTs of virtual sneakers yet,
they're probably filing trademarks to make sure that no one else can beat them to the punch.
so they're basically saying, we may not be doing this yet, but we're protecting our territory.
Exactly. It's a defensive move to prevent unauthorized use of their brand in this new digital landscape.
Smart. But even with these defensive filings, actually enforcing trademarks against infringing NFTs is proving to be a challenge. Right?
Yeah. It is. As the report points out, there isn't a lot of legal precedent on how courts will view the relationship between physical goods and digital goods for trademark purposes.
So a company might have a trademark for physical bicycles.
But a judge might not see that as strong enough to protect them against someone selling NFTs of similar-looking virtual bicycles.
We need more clarity from the
That's
courts.
what we do.
And then we have the added complication of blockchain domain names. They're often linked to NFTs. How do those fit into the trademark picture?
Yeah, blockchain domain names are a whole other beast. They operate outside of the traditional domain name system that's managed by ICANN.
Which means there's no central authority to handle trademark disputes.
Right. So if someone registers a blockchain domain name that infringes on your trademark,
You're kind of stuck.
it can be really difficult to get it back. You might have to track down the owner of the NFT that controls the domain and try to negotiate with them directly.
That sounds like a nightmare.
It can be.
Yeah.
And this lack of a central authority makes enforcing trademarks in the blockchain world a real challenge.
And the report recommends creating some kind of centralized system for handling these disputes, right?
Exactly. Something like ICANN's UDRP process, but for blockchain domains.
Okay, so lots to consider with trademarks and NFTs. And just like with the Copyright Office, there's also the idea of the USPTO potentially using NFTs in its own operations.
Yeah, some legal experts have proposed that the USPTO could start issuing trademark registration certificates as NFTs.
Similar to the idea of NFT-based copyright certificates.
It's all about exploring the potential benefits of blockchain technology for these government agencies.
Okay. Finally, let's talk about patents. How are NFTs interacting with the world of inventions?
Patents are interesting because they protect the actual technology itself, not just creative works like copyright or brand names like trademark.
So how do NFTs fit into that?
Well, one potential application is using NFTs to manage patent rights. They could potentially simplify the process of transferring ownership of patents.
It would be like transferring the deed to a house, but for a patent.
And you could potentially use smart contracts built into the NFTs to automate royalty payments.
So if someone licenses your patent, the royalties could be automatically distributed based on the terms in the smart contract.
That's the idea.
Pretty cool.
And the report even mentions the possibility of using NFTs to create fractional ownership of patents.
So multiple people could each own a piece of a patent represented by NFTs.
That could potentially make it easier for small businesses or individual inventors to invest in and profit from patent rights.
So that's how NFTs could be used to manage existing patents. But what about getting patent protection for inventions related to NFTs themselves?
That's where things get tricky.
Yeah.
The report points out that it's not enough to just use existing blockchain or NFT technology in a new way.
You have to actually create something truly new and innovative.
Right. Just sticking a blockchain onto an existing process probably isn't going to cut it.
So creating a standard NFT marketplace using well-known blockchain functions is probably not patentable.
But if you invent a new type of NFT with unique technical features or a truly innovative way of using blockchain in an NFT system, then you might be able to get patent protection.
The basic requirements for patentability, novelty, and non-obviousness, they still apply in the world of NFTs.
They do.
Yeah.
And then you have the whole issue of inventorship when AI is involved.
Right. If an AI helps create a new NFT-related technology, who gets listed as the inventor on the patent application?
That's a really tough question that patent lawyers are grappling with right now.
And just like with copyrights and trademarks, there's also the suggestion that the USPTO could start issuing patents as NFTs.
Yeah. But the report mentions that there's a lot of skepticism about whether this would actually provide any real benefits.
The patent community seems to be approaching NFTs with a bit more caution.
They are. The focus seems to be on making sure that the core principles of patent law, like novelty and non-obviousness, aren't diluted by the hype surrounding NFTs.
Makes sense. Okay, to wrap things up, we wanted to briefly touch on a couple of real-world examples that are mentioned in the report. First, let's talk about the NFT marketplace NFTify.
NFTify is interesting because they're trying to create a more open and accessible platform for independent creators and entrepreneurs.
They want to empower individuals to participate in the NFT economy.
And their platform focuses on authenticity and brand building, providing tools and features that help creators establish their unique identity in the NFT space.
They also seem to be building a broader ecosystem around their marketplace with things like a directory of NFT stores and tools for launching new NFT projects.
Right, they're trying to create a whole suite of services to support creators.
And then we have the game Dark Forest. How does that illustrate the intersection of NFTs and gaming?
Dark Forest is a cool example of a play-to-earn game, where players can earn cryptocurrency by exploring a vast virtual universe and discovering new planets.
And the information we have suggests that they're incorporating NFTs into the gameplay, although it's still in development.
Yeah, it sounds like they're planning to allow players to potentially mine NFTs within the game world.
So these NFTs might represent unique in-game items or assets that players can own and trade.
Exactly. It's another example of how NFTs are being used to create new forms of digital ownership and value within gaming environments.
And this brings up some fascinating IP questions, like who owns the copyright to those in-game assets, the game developers or the players who acquire the NFTs?
It's a whole new frontier for IP law.
All right. We've covered a ton of ground today, exploring the exciting, confusing, and sometimes downright messy world of NFTs and intellectual property. As we reach the end of our deep dive, what are your final thoughts on this topic?
I think the big takeaway is that while NFTs offer a lot of potential, it's not a free-for-all. The basic principles of IP law still apply.
Copyright, trademark, and patent law, it all still matters in the world of NFTs.
And the technology itself can't solve those fundamental legal questions.
Owning an NFT doesn't automatically give you all the rights to the underlying work.
It's crucial to understand the licenses, the contracts, the terms of service, all that legal stuff that's associated with an NFT.
And the legal landscape is still catching up with this fast-evolving technology. We're seeing new lawsuits and legal challenges popping up all the time.
It's going to be fascinating to watch how this all plays out in the coming years.
Absolutely. As NFTs become more mainstream, we're going to need clearer rules of the road to balance innovation with the protection of intellectual property rights.
And as you continue to explore this space, as creators, as consumers, as investors,
remember to ask those critical questions about ownership, licensing, and the potential legal risks and opportunities that NFTs present.
Because as we've seen, the technology might be new, but the legal issues are often rooted in those fundamental principles of intellectual property law that have been around for centuries.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. We'll be back next time to explore another fascinating topic at the intersection of technology and the law.